My feet were already swollen before the dinner rush even started, and the tiled floor behind the bar felt like it was designed to punish anyone who stood still too long. The restaurant looked expensive from the street, all glass and gold light, but behind the scenes it was heat, steam, and the sharp smell of bleach that never truly left my hands. I kept my hair pulled back tight, not because it made me feel neat, but because loose strands invited criticism from managers who liked having reasons to look down on people. My white shirt was clean at the beginning of every shift, and my red apron always ended the night stained with wine drops and small streaks of sauce that looked like warnings. The regular customers never looked at me long enough to remember my face, and the ones who did usually looked for the wrong reasons. I was invisible in the way poor people become invisible, like a chair someone forgets they sat on. That was fine, because invisibility meant safety, and safety meant rent. Then he walked in, and the room changed as if the air had been rewritten. He did not announce himself, and he did not need to. The man was tall, handsome in a cold, precise way, with short black hair styled neatly back, and a calm expression that made other men look uncertain without understanding why. He wore a dark coat, expensive but understated, and he moved like he owned time, like he could slow it down if he wanted. Two men followed him, not as friends, but as shadows that had learned how to breathe. Conversations lowered themselves. Even the pianist, who was never asked to stop, softened the keys as if he had been warned without words. The hostess smiled too fast, then corrected her posture, like she had remembered her place. "Good evening, sir," she said, voice trembling at the edge. He nodded once, barely, then looked past her like she was a doorframe. When I stepped out with a tray of drinks, I felt his gaze find me, not hungry, not friendly, but assessing, like he was choosing where to place a knife. "You," he said, not loudly, and still the word cut through the room. I walked over because that was what I did, because refusal was a luxury I could not afford. Up close, his eyes were dark and still, and his face was unreadable in the way dangerous people often are. "Yes, sir?" I asked, keeping my voice steady while my stomach tightened. He held out his hand to accept a menu, and that was when I saw it. A ring on his finger, thick and heavy, with a distinctive crest that caught the light in a way that made my chest go tight. I had seen that crest in a different place in a different life, in the small memories I kept hidden like contraband. My mother had a ring like that, and I had watched her turn it in her palm when she thought nobody was looking, like it was a piece of history that could burn her. My throat dried out before I could stop myself. "Sir," I said, softer than I meant to. "My mother has a ring like yours." His hand froze in midair, and the world felt like it paused around it. The calm expression did not break, but something underneath it shifted, like a locked door had just recognized the correct key. His gaze sharpened until I felt exposed down to my bones. "What did you just say?" he asked, still quiet, still controlled, and that control was somehow worse than anger. I swallowed, aware that every person at the table was pretending not to listen while listening with their whole bodies. "My mother," I repeated, trying not to shake. "She has a ring with that crest." He did not blink for a long beat. Then he leaned back slightly, and one of the men behind him moved, just one step, as if preparing for something. "What is your name?" the man asked. I should have lied. I knew that immediately because names were threads, and threads could be pulled. But his voice wrapped around the question like it was already decided. "Nia," I said. His eyes did not leave mine. "Nia," he repeated, tasting it like he was testing whether it belonged to him. Then he turned his hand palm down on the table, hiding the ring from everyone else, as if he had suddenly remembered it was a weapon. "Bring me water," he said, and his tone made it sound like a command that extended beyond the table and into my future. I nodded, and my legs moved even though my mind wanted to run. As I walked away, my heart hammered so hard it felt like my body was trying to warn me. I told myself it was just a coincidence, just some rich man with an old ring, just the kind of story my exhausted brain would make dramatic. But when I glanced back, he was still watching me, and his gaze did not feel curious. It felt like possession beginning to take shape. I tried to keep working like nothing had happened, but my hands betrayed me in small ways, fumbling with glass rims, trembling as I refilled pitchers, slipping slightly on the wet edge of the service station. Every time I moved, I felt the weight of his attention like a hand on the back of my neck. I had served powerful people before, politicians with loud laughs and businessmen with greedy smiles, but this was different. This was quiet, and quiet made room for imagination, and imagination made room for fear. When I returned with water, he took the glass without thanking me, and his fingers brushed mine deliberately. Not an accident, not a flirtation, but a measurement. A shiver ran up my arm, and I hated that my body reacted when my mind screamed caution. "Tell me about your mother," he said, and the words were simple, but his tone implied there was only one safe answer, and it was truth. I tried to keep my face neutral. "She lives across town," I said. "She works nights." His mouth did not move, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Does she still have the ring?" he asked. I hesitated because my mother had always told me not to talk about it, not to show it, not to let anyone see it. She had said it brought trouble, and I had believed her because her fear was never dramatic, always real. "Yes," I admitted. "She keeps it hidden." The man's gaze lowered to my apron, to the way my fingers gripped the tray too tightly, then returned to my face with unnerving patience. "Why would she hide a family crest?" he asked. "Unless she stole it." My cheeks heated with anger, fast and dangerous. "She did not steal anything," I said, and my voice came out sharper than I intended. One of the shadow men shifted again, like my tone had insulted a god. The boss did not react with obvious offense. He only watched me, and then slowly he smiled. It was not warm. It was a recognition, like he had found exactly what he expected. "Good," he murmured. "You defend her." I realized too late that I had just shown him my weakness, and he looked pleased, like weakness was a door he knew how to open. The rest of the table ordered food in low voices, but their eyes kept flicking toward me, toward him, toward the invisible line that had formed between us. I walked back to the kitchen, and the noise hit me like a wave, but it did not drown the feeling in my chest. My manager, Paul, snapped at me for being slow, for looking distracted, for breathing wrong, and I nodded because that was my role, because survival meant swallowing humiliation whole. Yet even Paul's bullying felt smaller now, like background static compared to the presence in the dining room. When I carried out the appetizers, I found the boss waiting for me, his attention locked, his patience unsettling. "Sit," he said, pointing to the empty chair at the end of his table. I stared at him, sure I had misheard. "Sir, I can't," I began, but the shadow men looked up in the same instant, and the hostess looked away like she did not want to be involved. The boss tilted his head slightly. "You can," he said, and his voice implied the restaurant's rules were not real in his world. I should have refused again. I should have walked away. Instead, my body obeyed, and I lowered myself into the chair like I was stepping into a trap I could already feel closing. The table's linen smelled like money and expensive detergent, and the closeness of him made my lungs feel too small. "You are not here to serve tonight," he said. "You are here to answer." My mouth went dry. "Answer what?" I asked. He lifted his hand again, slowly, letting the ring show just enough to catch my gaze. "Where did your mother get that ring?" he asked. I swallowed, hearing my mother's voice in my head, hearing the warning woven into every story she had ever half told me. "She said it was for my father," I said, and the moment the words left me, I regretted them. The boss's eyes darkened with something that was not surprise, but confirmation. "Your father," he repeated softly, as if he already knew the man's name and the man's sins. Then he leaned forward, and his voice dropped lower, intimate enough to feel like a secret shared in the dark. "Do you know who I am, Nia?" I shook my head because I did not want to speak his name because names gave power and he already had too much. He studied me for a long beat. "My name is Kong Junesio," he said, calm and certain, and the way he said it made the syllables feel like a lock clicking shut. I had heard whispers, of course. Everyone in the city had. Not in the newspapers, not on television, but in the way people warned each other to be careful, to mind their routes, to not cross certain lines. I felt my blood turn cold. "You should not be talking to me," I whispered. He smiled again, still not warm. You should not have recognized my ring, he replied, and the words felt like fate pretending to be conversation. I did not remember standing up, but suddenly I was on my feet again, the tray clutched like a shield, my pulse loud in my ears. The restaurant felt smaller than it had a few minutes ago, like the walls had moved closer to keep me inside. Kong Jun-seo watched me with an expression that suggested he expected my panic, as if fear was the most predictable thing in the world. I need to work, I said, trying to sound normal, trying to pull the moment back into something ordinary. He did not argue. He simply looked at one of his men, and the man stood, walked toward the host's stand, and spoke quietly to the manager. I watched Paul's face change from annoyance to sudden obedience, and the sight of that made my stomach twist. Paul hurried over to me, eyes wide, voice too polite. "Nia, you can take your break now," he said, and I stared at him because he had never once offered me a break without making me feel guilty for needing it. I didn't ask. I began, but he cut me off. "Just take it," he said, and his gaze flicked toward Kong Jun-seo like he was afraid to look at him directly. I felt something cold settle in my chest, the knowledge that the restaurant's rules were no longer mine to follow. I walked toward the back hallway, toward the staff room, but Kong Jun-seo's presence followed. I knew he was behind me without turning because the air felt different, heavier, quieter. The staff room smelled like old coffee and damp coats, and the fluorescent light hummed overhead like an insect. I turned, and he was there, filling the doorway, too elegant for the cramped space, like a blade placed carefully on a cheap table. One of his men stood farther down the hall, not watching us directly, but close enough to remind me of consequences. "You are afraid," Kong Jun-seo said, and his tone was not mocking. It was clinical, almost gentle, which made it more terrifying. "You should be," I admitted, my voice thin. He stepped closer, slow and controlled, and the proximity made my skin prickle. "Fear is useful," he said. "It teaches you who has power." I swallowed, refusing to let tears rise because tears invited pity, and pity was a form of ownership I did not want. "What do you want from me?" I asked. His gaze moved over my face, over the tight pull of my hair, the tired shadows beneath my eyes, the red apron that marked me as someone meant to be ordered around. "I want the truth," he said. "And I want the ring." I shook my head before thinking. "It's not mine," I said. "It's my mother's." His eyes narrowed slightly, and his voice softened in a way that felt like a hand closing around my throat. "Everything connected to that ring becomes mine," he said. That is how legacy works. The word legacy hit me harder than threat because it implied history, blood, and decisions made long before I was born. "My mother doesn't even talk about it," I said. "She just keeps it hidden." Kong Juo's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "She hides it because she knows what it means," he replied. "And she hides you because you are part of what it means." My heart stumbled. "I don't understand," I whispered. He studied me for a moment, and something in his gaze shifted, a flash of something darker and more personal, like anger wrapped in discipline. "Your mother's choices created a problem," he said. "You are the living evidence of that problem." My hands clenched at my sides. "I'm not a problem," I said, and I hated how small my voice sounded. He stepped closer until I could smell his cologne, subtle and expensive, layered over the faint scent of cold night air. "Not to me," he murmured. "Not if you do what I say." The words should have made me furious. And they did, but they also made something else move in my chest, something confused and dangerous. I had spent my life being dismissed, mocked, used, but never spoken to like I mattered in a larger story. Even his menace carried a kind of attention that felt like gravity. "Why would you care about me?" I asked, and my voice broke slightly despite my effort. Kong Jun-seo lifted his hand, the ring catching the light, and he held it between us like a symbol and a warning. "Because someone you have never met built his empire with that crest," he said. "And because that crest does not appear in the hands of a waitress unless blood has been spilled or blood has been hidden." My stomach turned, images flashing of my mother's careful silence, her long nights, her habit of checking locks twice. "My father is dead," I blurted, because my mother had said it with a finality that ended questions. Kong Jun-seo's expression did not change. but the air felt colder. Maybe, he said. Or maybe he is exactly where he needs to be. I stared at him, and the room felt like it was tilting. You're lying, I whispered. You're trying to scare me. He leaned in, close enough that his voice brushed my ear like a confession. I do not need to lie to scare you, he said. I need only to tell you what is true. When he pulled back, his gaze held mine, steady and intimate in a way that made my breath catch despite myself. You will bring me to your mother, he said. Tonight. I felt my pulse spike. I can't, I said. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at me like refusal was a childish performance. You can, he replied. And you will. The ride in his car felt like stepping into another world where everything was quiet on purpose. The interior smelled like leather and faint smoke, and the windows were tinted so dark the city looked blurred, unreal, like a memory. I sat stiffly, my red apron folded in my lap because I had not even been allowed to change, and the contrast between my cheap uniform and the luxury around me made my skin burn with humiliation. Kong Junaseo sat beside me, not touching, not crowding, yet his presence filled the space more completely than any closeness could. Two enforcers sat in the front, silent, scanning the streets as if the city belonged to them. I kept my eyes forward, telling myself to memorize every turn, every landmark, because fear demanded preparation. You can still tell me no, I said, although my voice sounded like I was pretending. Kong Junaseo turned his head slightly, watching me with calm interest. No is a word for people who believe consequences are negotiable, he replied. I swallowed. So you're kidnapping me? I said, and the accusation came out brittle. He did not seem offended. If I wanted to kidnap you, he said, you would not have your phone, and you would not know where you are. I touched my pocket instinctively, feeling my phone still there, and the fact that he had pointed it out made me feel even more controlled. Why are you doing this the gentle way? I asked, and my voice carried more anger now, because anger was easier than panic. Kong Junaseo's gaze held mine for a moment, and something unspoken passed through it, something that felt like calculation mixed with restraint. Because you are not just leverage, he said. And because I do not enjoy breaking what I might need intact, my stomach twisted again at the casual cruelty of that logic. What do you need me for? I asked. He looked out the window for a beat, the city's lights sliding over his face like moving shadows. You are a bridge, he said. To a woman who thought she could disappear with something that belongs to my bloodline, the word bloodline landed hard, heavy with meaning I did not have and did not want. My mother doesn't belong to you, I snapped. He turned back to me slowly. She belongs to her choices, he said. And choices of owners. I hated him in that moment, and I also hated that part of me listened like his words mattered more than anyone else's had. The car stopped in front of my mother's building, an aging complex with peeling paint and a flickering hallway light that never worked properly. The contrast between his world and ours looked obscene. I stared at the entrance, my chest tight with dread. She'll be terrified, I whispered. Kong Junaseo's expression softened just slightly, in a way that made my breath catch because softness from him felt like a dangerous gift. Then do not scream, he said. Do not make it worse. I opened the door with shaking hands, my shoes crunching on gravel, and the cold air hit my face like a slap. His men followed at a respectful distance, not close enough to seem like a scene, but close enough to end any illusion of freedom. I led Kong Junaseo up the stairs, each step louder than it should have been, and my hands fumbled with the key. When I opened the door, my mother stood in the small kitchen, still in her nightclothes, hair wrapped, eyes tired but alert. The moment she saw me, relief flickered. The moment she saw him behind me, the relief shattered. Her face drained of color so fast it looked like a candle being snuffed out. Nia, she breathed, voice barely there. Her gaze locked onto the ring on Kong Junaseo's hand, and her body went rigid as if her bones had turned to stone. Kong Junaseo stepped into our cramped living room like he belonged there, like the walls were built to contain him. It has been a long time, he said, his voice calm, almost polite. My mother's lips trembled. You shouldn't be here, she whispered. Kong Junaseo's eyes did not soften for her. You should not have taken what was not yours, he replied. My mother looked at me then, and the look was not just fear. It was guilt, deep and ancient, like she had been carrying it so long it had shaped her spine. "Nia, go to your room," she said, voice breaking. I shook my head immediately. "No," I said. "Tell me the truth." Kong Junesio watched the exchange with a quiet satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "She deserves the truth," he said, and his gaze returned to my mother like a blade, finding its sheath. My mother's hands clenched at her sides. "You don't understand what you're doing," she told him. Kong Junesio stepped closer, and the air in the room seemed to tighten around his movement. "I understand exactly," he said. "You hit a crest. You hit a child. And you hit a story that belongs to me." My mother's eyes glistened, and for the first time I saw her not as the woman who worked and worried and survived, but as someone trapped inside a past she had never escaped. "Please," she whispered, and the words sounded like surrender. Kong Junesio's gaze flicked to me, and something in it felt intimate, almost possessive, like he was already rewriting where I belonged. "Tell her," he commanded softly. "Or I will." My mother closed her eyes like she was bracing for a blow that had been falling for decades, and when she opened them again, something in her expression had shifted from panic to exhausted resolve. She moved slowly to the small wooden table by the window, the one with the uneven leg, and reached into a hidden compartment beneath a loose panel. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out a folded cloth, worn thin from years of careful handling. When she unfolded it, the ring lay there, heavy and unmistakable, its crest catching the dim light of the apartment in the same cold, deliberate way it had caught the light in the restaurant. My chest tightened as realization settled in, sharp and disorienting. Kong Junesio watched without interrupting, his posture relaxed, his patience predatory. "I did not steal it," my mother said quietly, her voice steadying as if confession gave her structure. "He gave it to me." Kong Junesio's eyes narrowed, just a fraction. "He was not yours to take," he replied. My mother laughed softly then, a sound stripped of humor. "Men like him never belong to anyone," she said. "They just decide who they ruin." I felt anger flare, raw and protective. "Who is he?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite myself. My mother looked at me with something like sorrow mixed with relief, as if she had been waiting for this moment longer than she wanted to admit. "Your father," she said, and the words landed like a fracture spreading through my chest. Kong Junesio inhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "My brother," he corrected calmly, and the room seemed to tilt as the truth rearranged itself around that sentence. My knees felt weak, and I grabbed the edge of the counter to stay upright. "Brother," I echoed, disbelief tasting bitter on my tongue. My mother nodded once. "He was powerful," she said. "Cruel when he wanted to be. Gentle only when it suited him." Kong Junesio's gaze hardened, shadows deepening around his eyes. "He was a liability," he said flatly. "And he paid for it." I stared at him, horror and fascination twisting together. "You killed him," I whispered. Kong Junesio did not deny it. "I ended a threat," he replied. "And you are the consequence he left behind." Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I felt suddenly small, like the ground beneath my life had shifted and revealed a depth I could not measure. My mother reached for me, her hand warm and familiar, grounding. "I try to protect you," she said, her voice breaking at last. "I hid you because his world destroys everything it touches." Kong Junesio watched the gesture with an expression I could not read, something like calculation tangled with restraint. "And yet," he said softly, "here she is." His gaze returned to me, intense and intimate, and I felt a strange pull, like gravity reasserting itself. "You have his eyes," he added, and the words sent a shiver through me I did not want to acknowledge. I did not sleep that night, not really. Kong Junesio allowed my mother and me a few hours alone, though his men remained stationed outside the apartment like silent sentinels. My mother paced, wringing her hands, apologizing in fragments, explaining pieces of a story she had buried for years. She told me about a man who had promised protection and delivered fear, about love that felt like captivity, about escape purchased with silence and distance. I listened, numb and aching, trying to reconcile the woman who had raised me with the past she described. When dawn crept in through the thin curtains, painting the room in pale gray light, Kong Jun-seo returned. He looked unchanged, immaculate, as if the night had been nothing more than a pause in his routine. "You will come with me," he said to me, not unkindly. My mother's breath caught. "No," she said immediately. Kong Jun-seo's gaze flicked to her, cool and final. "She is already part of my world," he replied. "Keeping her here will only make her a target." I felt my heart race, torn between fear and something darker, something that whispered inevitability. "What happens to her?" I asked, nodding toward my mother. Kong Jun-seo regarded me for a long moment. "She will be left alone," he said. "Provided she remains invisible." My mother reached for my face, tears spilling freely now. "You don't have to go," she pleaded. I looked at her, at the lines carved by worry and sacrifice, and then at Kong Jun-seo, standing calm and powerful in our small, fragile space. I understood then that refusal would not save me, only delay the collision. "I'll go," I said quietly, and the words felt like surrender and choice braided together. Kong Jun-seo inclined his head, approval flickering briefly across his features. "You are smarter than he was," he said. "That may keep you alive." His compound was nothing like I had imagined, tucked behind layers of security, blending modern luxury with deliberate austerity. Everything was clean, controlled, designed to remind you that chaos was not welcome here. Kong Jun-seo assigned me a room overlooking a private courtyard. The silence, so complete it felt unnatural. "You will stay," he told me. "You will learn." I bristled at the implication. "Learn what?" I asked. He turned to face me fully, his gaze heavy with meaning. "Who you are," he replied. Days blurred into a strange rhythm of observation and instruction. Men deferred to him without question, women moved carefully around him, and I watched the machinery of power operate with terrifying efficiency. Kong Jun-seo spoke to me often, sometimes about business, sometimes about history, sometimes about my father in ways that were both condemning and uncomfortably intimate. I found myself listening despite my resistance, absorbing lessons about control, leverage, silence. At night, alone in my room, I lay awake replaying his words, hating how they made sense. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting I had been allowed to observe, Kong Jun-seo joined me in the courtyard. The air was cool, the lights low. "You are adapting," he said. I crossed my arms. "I don't have a choice," I replied. He stepped closer, his presence commanding yet strangely grounding. "Choice is overrated," he said. "Power is what matters." His gaze softened, just slightly, and my breath caught despite myself. "And you have potential." The admission stirred something dangerous in me, a flicker of pride I had never been allowed to feel before. The first time he touched me, it was almost accidental, his hand brushing mine as he guided me through a document. The contact sent a jolt through me, unwanted and undeniable. He noticed immediately, his eyes darkening with interest. "You feel it too," he said softly. I pulled my hand back. "This isn't what you think," I insisted. He smiled faintly. "It is exactly what I think," he replied. The tension between us grew, charged and unspoken, woven into every interaction. He never forced it, never crossed a line without my silent permission, and that restraint made the pull stronger, more confusing. I hated how safe I felt under his watch, how the fear of the outside world faded within his walls. When violence came, sudden and brutal, I saw his other side clearly. He ended a threat with chilling precision, his calm unbroken, his authority absolute. Later, when I confronted him, shaking with adrenaline and horror, he met my gaze without apology. "This is the world you are part of," he said. "Decide whether you will survive it or be destroyed by it." I realized then that I had already begun to choose. By the time I stood beside him in public, introduced not as a waitress but as someone under his protection, the transformation felt complete. People looked at me differently, with caution and curiosity instead of dismissal. Kong Jun-seo's hand rested lightly at my back, a possessive gesture that steadied me even as it marked me. "You belong here," he murmured, low enough that only I could hear. I should have recoiled from the word belong, but instead I felt a strange sense of alignment, like a fractured part of me had found its place. The girl who had stood invisible behind a bar felt distant, almost unreal. In her place stood someone who understood power, who wielded silence like a blade, who knew the cost of legacy. As I met the gazes around me without flinching, I felt fear recede, replaced by something darker and more intoxicating. Acceptance did not come as relief, but as clarity, sharp and irrevocable.